Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we'll be sharing a summary of the work of our advisory panel and engagement with interested parties in potentially building towards a pan-Canadian coordinated approach to newborn screening. I'm Dan Singh. I'm the Director of Strategy and Innovation at Canada's Drug Agency, and I'm excited to introduce you to our panel's co-chairs. Dr. Hilary Vallance is the Medical Director of the BC Newborn Screening Program and a medical biochemist and biochemical geneticist at BC's Children's Hospital. Hilary has more than 50 peer-reviewed publications on newborn screening and inborn errors of metabolism, and some of her research has been in partnership with BC First Nation communities. Whitney Ayoub-Goulstone is the Executive Director of Immunity Canada. Whitney is also the past chair of the Network of Rare Blood Disorder Organizations, a board member of the International Patient Organization for Primary Immunodeficiencies, a member of the Patient Network for the APEC Business Ethics Forum, and Whitney has been working in patient advocacy and engagement for over 15 years. Next slide. Canada's Drug Agency recognizes the traditional territories, rights, and diversity of all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across Canada. Indigenous peoples have been and continue to be excluded from and harmed by Canada's healthcare systems. In the spirit of reconciliation, we are committed to addressing these inequities alongside Indigenous communities. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 within the Mississaugas of the Credit. Next slide. Here's what we'll cover today, beginning with a quick overview of the work of the advisory panel, and then we'll be spending most of our time talking about how the advisory panel engaged with different individuals, including who participated in these engagement opportunities, some highlights of the input we received, and how that input actually informed the advisory panel's discussions. We'll then close off the webinar with our next steps. And if we do have time, we might be able to take a question or two from the audience. You should see a Q&A button in your Zoom window where you can enter one in. Next slide. We know that some of you might be familiar with the work of the advisory panel, while others might be joining us just for the first time. So just wanted to start off setting a bit of context up front. Back in March 2023, the Government of Canada announced a total investment of up to $1.5 billion over 3 years in support of a national strategy for drugs for rare diseases, which has 4 pillars. Canada's Drug Agency is a leader in providing evidence-informed solutions, advice, and recommendations to best support health systems across Canada in supporting the national strategy for drugs for rare diseases through activities related to the 3rd pillar of the strategy. And we're working to improve the collection and use of evidence to help optimize access to drugs for rare diseases in Canada. So early identification through newborn screening for rare diseases is an important component to support the national strategy. And one of the key activities to support the strategy was to establish an ad hoc newborn screening advisory panel to provide credible strategic advice and expertise to recommend a model to support evidence-informed decision-making for newborn screening programs in Canada. One of the main objectives for the advisory panel is to draft recommendations that we've published in our final report. Next slide. As mentioned, our work is guided by Pillar 3 of the strategy, data and evidence collection projects that focus on all stages of the product lifecycle, including an interactive tool to provide decision makers with information on emerging drugs for rare diseases to better prepare health systems, a panel to develop guidance on newborn screening access across Canada, and that's our focus today. Also, customized drug reviews to advise decision makers, as well as standards and tools to improve the data from rare disease registries. So these are intended to be coordinated and aligned work streams to provide decision makers with a more complete picture of health system implementation considerations. For example, understanding the treatments that may be on the horizon will also help understand the need for identifying patients through newborn screening. And the registry's work will inform the types of data and information that may need to be collected to support the emerging drug products that have been reviewed downstream. And of course, the customized support provides a pathway for decision makers to learn more about specific questions that they may have. I think I'm passing it over to one of our co-chairs.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. So what we're going to start with is the context and the scope of our work. Next slide, thanks. So in Canada, there are 7 newborn screening programs funded by provinces and territories. Newborn screening refers to the tests that are done shortly after birth to check for serious but treatable conditions. Screening helps to identify certain conditions as early as possible to prevent serious health problems. Early identification of rare diseases through newborn screening allows for timely diagnosis and appropriate access to treatments and supports early in life. The focus of the advisory panel's work is on the blood spot newborn screening test, recognizing that there is a broader context of newborn screening that might be considered in the future. Next slide. While much progress has been accomplished in newborn screening programs at the provincial and territorial level, there's an opportunity to help foster greater consistency on the conditions screened and to support continuous quality improvement in the screening process. In the next few slides, we will provide an overview of the advisory panel, the project timeline, and the draft guidance report. Next slide. To support this opportunity to enhance pan-Canadian coordination of newborn screening programs, Canada's Drug Agency has hosted an ad hoc time-limited advisory panel composed of 2 co-chairs and 11 members, Stan mentioned, who come from across Canada and bring together a range of expertise and experience, including healthcare providers, newborn screening lab directors, program administrators, persons with lived and living experience, and individuals with backgrounds in bioethics, law, and health administration. The panel also has persons from across Canada with diverse representation, including gender, race, and culture. The names, biographies, and conflict of interest declarations of the 13 members are available on the Canada's Drug Agency website. Great, thank you. The advisory panel met 4 times between January and June of 2024 to develop draft guidance for a pan-Canadian approach to newborn screening. In July of 2024, a public webinar was held to provide information about the advisory panel's work and included the release of a discussion paper. Between July and September of 2024, input was invited from interested parties on our discussion paper through various formats that will be discussed in this webinar. In October and November, the advisory panel met to discuss and incorporate the feedback received and to create recommendations. Today, we will be presenting an overview of the engagement activities, the input received through those activities, and how the input informed the advisory panel's discussion. The final report with recommendations will be submitted to Health Canada and will be made publicly available by the end of the month. Next slide, thank you. The discussion paper covered 6 areas, which included a set of proposed guiding principles, a future coordinated model for newborn screening in Canada, exploring opportunities to enhance newborn screening processes for adding and reassessing conditions, developing criteria for adding and removing conditions to a newborn screening panel, proposing a pan-Canadian newborn screening list of conditions, and anticipating emerging newborn screening conditions. The purpose of this discussion paper was to support engagement from interested parties on the proposed guidance. We will now take a closer look at the engagement activities and the input we received. I'll hand over to my co-chair, Whitney. Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you, Hilary. First, we would like to thank all the individuals and organizations who took the time to provide their input. The insights and wisdom you shared with us have been so appreciated. As Hilary mentioned, we started by holding a public webinar on July 11th, 2024 to provide information about our work and to invite interested parties to provide input on the advisory panel's discussion paper. There were 2 sets of distinct engagement activities, which we'll talk about. The first was an online consultation forum where interested parties could submit their input. The second were a series of focus groups and discussions and key informant interviews. First, we're going to discuss the online consultation process. The online consultation process was a form that was available both in English and French and was open for public submissions for 2 months between July 11th and September 11th. The form included 11 questions, and the questions were related to different sections of the discussion paper. To ensure transparency, the submissions received will be published in full and posted on Canada Drug Agency website. For a quick overview of the submissions received through the online consultation process, we're just going to go through a little bit here on this slide. We received a total of 35 submissions. The chart here shows the number of submissions received by type of response. The highest number of submissions came from respondents identifying as patient groups with 15 submissions. Next, there were 6 submissions from healthcare providers, 5 from industry, 3 from a health authority or hospital. 1 submission was made from a respondent from a HTA agency, 1 public member, and a researcher. Lastly, there were 2 submissions classified as other. Those respondents included a healthcare ethicist and a member of an academic research network. I would note that while only 1 respondent identified as representing a provincial newborn screening program, further investigation of the submissions revealed that several submissions were from individuals directly involved with or associated with provincial newborn screening programs. When taking a closer look at the geographic representation from the online consultation submissions, 18 were from organizations that represented people from across Canada, 16 came from individuals or organizations situated within a jurisdiction within Canada, and 1 submission was from outside of Canada. For the focus groups and the key informant interviews, the advisory panel wanted to ensure that the perspectives of those who are made vulnerable by social and/or economic policies, those who are disproportionately affected by newborn screening due to higher prevalence of inherited disorders, and persons who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit were solicited and incorporated into the guidance. With this in mind, Canada's Drug Agency engaged Sage Solutions, which is an Indigenous-run consultant service that offers support in Indigenous and community engagement. Sage Solutions was asked to conduct online focus groups with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. The consultant managed recruitment and participants. This was via direct invitation and social media posts, and worked with Canada's Drug Agency on the engagement materials. On behalf of the panel, Canada's Drug Agency also extended invitations to individuals and organizations who provide community birthing care and who are from and work with underrepresented and underserved populations. It was important to seek input from different perspectives, particularly from individuals who would not have had the opportunity or would not be typically engaged through existing networks within Canada's Drug Agency. The focus group discussions and key informant interviews were scheduled for 1 hour. A summary highlighting 3 sections of the discussion paper was shared with participants for their review in advance of the meeting. Due to time constraints, the guiding principles, the criteria for adding a condition and emerging newborn screening conditions were prioritized for these discussions. Sage Solutions conducted 3 distinction-based focus groups with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in September of 2024. There were a total of 21 participants in these focus groups. Canada's Drug Agency conducted a focus group with 3 participants and 3 key informant interviews with individuals who provide community birthing care and who are from or work with underrepresented and underserved populations in September and October. 2 separate reports were drafted to summarize the findings from the focus group discussions. The first report summarizes the findings from the focus group discussions led by Sage Solutions. The second summarizes the focus group and key informant interviews led by Canada's Drug Agency. Draft versions of the reports were shared with participants for validation and to provide participants with the opportunity to review and provide feedback. The reports will be published on the Canada's Drug Agency website and provide further details describing the findings of the focus groups and key informant interviews. After receiving all of the input, it was time for the advisory panel to review. In advance of the 5th advisory panel meeting, a summary of the input was shared with the advisory panel, along with the 35 individual consultation submissions and the 2 summaries of the focus group and key informant interview discussions. Over the 2 meetings, the advisory panel carefully reviewed all of the input, discussed key themes, and made decisions on how to incorporate suggestions into the final guidance. There were also a number of important out-of-scope topics that were identified by respondents. The advisory panel decided that some topics should be included in the report as other considerations. Now we're going to share some highlights of what we heard and how that input played a role in the advisory panel's deliberations and developing of the guidance. Unfortunately, we only have enough time to share a short snapshot of the input we received, but please know that all input was reviewed and considered before drafting. The first section of the discussion paper included the proposed guiding principles. As a quick reminder, the advisory panel proposed 6 draft guiding principles, which included health rights of the newborn, equity, effectiveness, safety, and quality, transparency, collaboration, and sustainability. Given the aim of newborn screening, the panel felt that the health rights of the newborn to achieve the highest attainable standard of health should be the top priority, and therefore should be an overarching guiding principle for all newborn screening activities. For the full definitions of the guiding principles, including the advisory panel's rationale, please refer to the discussion paper. Through the online consultation form and during our focus group and key informant interview discussions, respondents were asked for their perspectives and opinions on the proposed guiding principles and their definitions. Overall, respondents generally agreed with the proposed guiding principles, and a lot of the input received was requesting further elaboration or clarification. Here, we will highlight some of the key themes that came from the input that we received, and on the following slide, we'll share how the advisory panel addressed these themes. There were some requests for the guiding principle definitions to expand and include considerations for the family, caregivers, and the community. A number of respondents asked for definitions to be reworded to focus on the well-being of the newborn and to include holistic care. Respondents were also looking for clarity surrounding the definition of terms, such as quality and partners. Other respondents requested for other concepts to be included within certain definitions, concepts such as timeliness and openness. Another theme that arose in the feedback related to equity was to address additional barriers and challenges to access. There were requests to acknowledge that tensions may exist between the guiding principles. As an example, aspects of sustainability could be in conflict with the health rights of the newborn. Respondents were also seeking clarity on how tensions between guiding principles managed. The advisory panel identified the opportunity to provide further clarity on linkages between the guiding principles, as there were requests to reword definitions to incorporate aspects that were described within another guiding principle definition. Upon consideration of the feedback received, the advisory panel first discussed opportunities to elaborate or clarify different terms and to incorporate numerous concepts. For the interest of time, we can't go through every change made, but the advisory panel did want to highlight a few examples. For the first example, the advisory panel elaborated on the health rights of the newborn, including clarification that the term health is intended to encompass the well-being of the newborn and holistic care. Another example includes the advisory panel defining the term partners, which is used within the collaboration definition. The term partners is intended to include everyone that is interested in collaborating and is not limited. Additional input received relates to the equity guiding principle. The equity definition was changed to include considerations for not only the newborn, but also their families, caregivers, and communities. Also, the advisory panel acknowledges that many inequities exist within current newborn screening systems. Therefore, within the explanatory text for the equity, additional barriers and challenges will be highlighted, and some examples will be shared based on the input that was received in the report. The advisory panel also sought to clarify the purpose and interplay of the guiding principles. These guiding principles are a core set of values that guided the advisory panel's work and are intended to shape and inform a pan-Canadian approach to newborn screening. The advisory panel will clarify in the final report that the guiding principles are intended to be considered collectively as they influence, balance, support, and in some cases build on one another. In addition, at times, the guiding principles may be in tension with one another and will require careful balancing and transparent justification when managing these tensions. Now we're going to move on to the next section that explored a future coordinated newborn screening model. The figure on this slide represents a high-level illustration of what a potential coordinated system could look like. The intent of the proposed coordinated model is to complement jurisdictional newborn screening programs by supporting alignment across Canada, with provinces and territories retaining autonomy to tailor their newborn screening programs to local needs. And it also is an opportunity to engage with patients and experts working in this space to contribute to newborn screening in Canada. The overall vision considers using an advisory coordinating body to support the integration of the proposed structure into our health systems. Information sharing, collaboration, and communication between provincial and territorial ministries of health, newborn screening programs, and across all committees was also identified as an important component to support the successful implementation of the newborn screening work across Canada. I will highlight a few of the key functions of the committees to provide you with a sense of their roles. Starting with the proposed Newborn Screening Advisory Committee. Such a committee could provide a coordinated forum for communication for newborn screening programs and the provincial and territorial ministries of health, build relationships within the broader drugs for rare disease space, provide oversight and advise committees, and deliberate and provide final recommendations on adding or removing conditions. Next, an expert review committee could review nominations, conduct evidence reviews and horizon scans, and draft recommendations. Lastly, some of the potential key functions of the Quality Standards Education Committee would be to provide guidance on best practices and to coordinate a data repository for continuous quality improvement, develop education materials, and provide learning opportunities for health professionals and the public. Data collected and reviewed could be used to reassess conditions for opportunities for quality improvement. This could make changes to screening algorithms or even to consider removing a condition if, in practice, it's determined it does not meet criteria for newborn screening. For the future coordinated newborn screening model, respondents highlighted the opportunity for an existing organization to support the proposed coordinated model. Respondents shared the example of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, which is hosted by the Public Health Agency of Canada, noting that the Public Health Agency of Canada may be a model to consider, given their expertise in screening and healthcare delivery. Some respondents indicated that other pan-Canadian organizations, such as Canada's Drug Agency, may also be a good fit, with its expertise in health technology assessments and strength in governorship of the different interested parties. Respondents also noted that they felt the federal, provincial, and territorial ministries of health should have the opportunity to participate in the different committees, even if as observers. Input highlighted the need to keep the committee structures streamlined with no more than one or two committees or subcommittees to ensure effectiveness, efficiency, and alignment to timeliness, and to reduce duplication of efforts. Lastly, respondents also pointed to opportunities for connections between the proposed coordinating model and community-based organizations and patient groups. The advisory panel discussed the long-term vision that considers the three proposed committees being housed within an existing organizational structure. The advisory panel acknowledges that there is an opportunity to implement a coordinated model by building from an existing organization. Based on input received through engagement activities, the advisory panel reflected on how committees are established, how they will need to be governed by a set mandate. They noted that representatives of provinces and territories could act as observers in these committees to better understand the evidentiary information being provided. In keeping with the input received, highlighting the need to keep committee structures streamlined, the advisory panel acknowledges that the governance model should seek to ensure efficiency and streamline process wherever possible. Respondents also pointed to opportunities for connections between the proposed coordinated model and community-based organizations and patient groups. The advisory panel recognized the importance of engaging with the public and patients and added details regarding opportunities for engagement within the proposed committee's composition and function. Now I'll pass it back to Hilary to talk about proposed processes for evaluation and condition.
Whitney. The next area that we requested input on was the proposed processes to support adding or reassessing conditions. The discussion paper outlined that the process contains 4 key steps: a process to nominate conditions for review, an evidence review process, a process for deliberation and recommendation, and processes for engagement and communication. There was general support and agreement among respondents on the proposed process. On the evidence review process, several respondents expressed concerns related to why an evidence review would be required if an evidence review had already been completed by a newborn screening program in Canada or internationally. There were concerns that this could slow down the process of recommending and adding conditions. The advisory panel agrees that previously published high-quality evidence reviews absolutely can be used along with other sources of evidence that relate to the Canadian context or variations across Canadian jurisdictions. Next slide. Additional constructive input on the proposed processes are summarized on this slide. Respondents indicated that conflict of interest disclosure should be required at all stages: the nomination, review, and engagement recommendation stages. The advisory panel discussed and fully supports requesting conflict of interest disclosures. Secondly, input from respondents highlighted that the different steps in the process should include various perspectives. For instance, for evidence review, respondents felt it should be mandatory to include laboratory and clinical expertise for the rare disease under consideration. Respondents also felt that there should be representation from the provincial territorial jurisdictions and be inclusive of those with lived and living experience and the public, supporting the guiding principles of equity and collaboration. Discussions by the advisory panel essentially agreed with this feedback. Lastly, input from respondents spoke to addressing other considerations within the deliberation and recommendation process, specifically the short and long-term implications of newborn screening on newborns, family, and health systems. Respondents voiced that considerations for specialized treatment, for instance, and access to various services should be included. Some respondents voiced concern about ensuring consideration of access to services for persons living in remote communities. Respondents pointed out that families relocating for medical care often lack financial resources and support, and that there should be consideration for families that might need to travel long distances and deal with interjurisdictional logistical issues. The advisory panel agreed that these implications should be considered within the deliberative and recommendation process. We'll now move on to the proposed criteria for adding a condition to the Pan-Canadian Newborn Screening Test Panel. As outlined in the discussion paper, many jurisdictions in Canada and internationally use explicit predefined criteria when considering the addition of a condition to their screening panel. The criteria cover several domains, including the condition, the test, treatments, and societal and other considerations tailored to the condition under review. In developing the proposed criteria, we began by reviewing the 1968 World Health Organization Wilson and Jungner criteria, which were found to still be relevant and foundational for considering new conditions for test panels. However, the panel recognized that these criteria need to be tailored to the current newborn screening environment and adapted to be relevant to Canada. Therefore, some modifications to the criteria were proposed, and these are laid out in the discussion paper. Respondents generally agreed with the modifications. However, several respondents felt that the Wilson and Jungner criteria were sufficient. The respondents who disagreed voiced that the Wilson and Jungner criteria are a long-standing World Health Organization framework and therefore should not be altered. However, the advisory panel felt that some revision of the Wilson and Jungner criteria were needed to add clarity and reflect more recent advances in newborn screening. Additional feedback on the criteria are summarized on this slide. Some respondents asked how the criteria will be interpreted. Respondents noted the need to have more detailed methodology on the deliberative process that would allow for clarity between opinions and transparency in interpreting and applying the criteria. Respondents also indicated that there were opportunities to improve the language used within the criteria to enhance clarity. For example, respondents indicated that the condition should arise early in life and to be clear on what is meant by treatable. Some respondents felt that the criteria relating to a recognizable latent or early symptomatic stage should not be removed. There were also requests to clarify who benefits from newborn screening, specifically how the criteria will account for variability in populations, such as particular founder populations who have higher prevalence of some rare diseases. The advisory panel discussed all this feedback at length. As noted previously, some of those consulted felt that the original Wilson and Jungner criteria were sufficient and should not be modified. However, the advisory panel felt it was necessary to update the original criteria for the current context of newborn screening. Regarding the removal of the criterion stating that the condition should have a pre-symptomatic or latency period, Wilson and Jungner, who published this paper in 1968, published this at a time when the only condition screened was phenylketonuria, PKU. Unlike PKU, many conditions on current test panels may present within days of birth and even be symptomatic by the time newborn screening results are reported. The advisory panel recognized that this in itself doesn't mean that those affected infants would not benefit from newborn screening. A condition that presents early, even before reporting newborn screening results, could still be a good candidate for newborn screening. The criteria were modified to clarify that eligible conditions are those that manifest in early life, the neonatal period, infancy, or early childhood, as opposed to later in life, adolescence or adulthood, and also clarified in the criteria that the benefit of screening is for the newborn. The advisory panel agreed that understanding the natural history of the condition under review was important and included the pre-symptomatic or latency period in this context in the criteria. There was also input asking for clarity on how the criteria will account for regional and jurisdictional variability in populations and condition incidence, particularly in subpopulations who are frequently underserved or underrepresented. The advisory panel felt that the modified criteria allowed for this variation. We recognize that the population of Canada is increasingly diverse and that there is often limited evidence about the incidence of many conditions within cultural ethnic subpopulations, which is an important consideration when making recommendations about specific conditions. Lastly, the advisory panel agrees with the feedback received that further work is needed on the deliberative processes. This will be included in the final guidance report. Reassessment in newborn screening is a quality improvement activity to reevaluate conditions that are already being screened as part of a program. Reassessment may evaluate test performance and/or clinical outcomes to measure actual health benefits and potential harms, looking for opportunities to improve test performance and/or clinical utility of screening. A reassessment may result in changes to the way screening and confirmatory testing is conducted. Rarely, a recommendation could be made to stop screening for a condition if harms exceed benefits and harms cannot be mitigated. As part of the process for reassessing a condition, the advisory panel reviewed Australia's newborn screening framework, which outlines one of the few published guidance documents for reassessing a condition on a newborn screening list. The framework includes questions or prompts that cover similar domains to those in Wilson-Jungner's criteria. The advisory panel made modifications to contextualize for pan-Canadian decision-making. There was agreement among respondents to use the adapted framework for reassessing a condition. The main piece of input we received relating to reassessment of conditions for newborn screening was to provide additional clarity on the purpose of reassessment. Respondents were concerned that the reassessment process may be used to justify removing conditions for cost saving. The advisory panel discussed how reassessment of a condition may be undertaken for a number of reasons. For example, reassessment may be recommended if there are unexpected, unanticipated outcomes, and the reassessment may result in changes in the way newborn screening is carried out to improve outcomes. At times, reassessment can be initiated with the potential result being the removal of a condition, but it is much more likely that a reassessment will take place from a quality improvement standpoint. When developing the proposed pan-Canadian newborn screening list, the advisory panel reviewed previous newborn screening work that was done at the pan-Canadian level back in 2016. We identified an opportunity to build on this work as the conditions that were proposed in 2016 have been adopted or in the process of being adopted by most newborn screening programs in Canada. In the discussion paper, the advisory panel proposed 25 conditions for inclusion on the pan-Canadian newborn screening list, and an additional 9 conditions that may require further evidence review in order to make a decision regarding the inclusion of on the pan-Canadian newborn screening list. When respondents were asked if they agreed with the pan-Canadian newborn screening list, there was general agreement. However, there were several respondents who voiced concerns. The disagreement related to the process for how the 9 conditions were identified for evidence review, and concerned that some of these should be on the approved list and may not require formal evidence review. Examples were given such as Hilary disease, MPS 1, and homocystinuria, which, in the opinion of several respondents, had already been reviewed, funded, and implemented in many provinces. Some recommended expedited review. In the final report, the advisory panel will provide additional details on how conditions were selected for the list of conditions and potential next steps to support the review process for these conditions. We will discuss this further on the next 2 slides. Numerous respondents sought clarity on the application of the proposed pan-Canadian newborn screening list. Specifically, they are wondering if the list will be a recommended minimum standard. If it is proposed as a minimum standard, then it could limit innovation and justify attempts to defund screening. As previously mentioned, multiple recommendations were made to consider adding conditions to the proposed pan-Canadian newborn screening list and the list of conditions that require an evidence review. Some respondents felt very strongly that the conditions on the evidence review list should be on the proposed pan-Canadian list, and at times, respondents voiced concern with the rationale for developing the list of conditions that require an evidence review. Respondents also noted that additional clarity was required within the pan-Canadian list, especially reaching consensus on case definitions for the conditions. Newborn screening programs have primary and secondary condition lists. So let me just explain what that means. A primary condition is generally the primary target of screening and the condition that was actually reviewed for the test panel. Secondary conditions are those that may also be detected by the specific screening test and for which there may be less evidence of benefit. However, there is inconsistency across provincial territorial newborn screening programs in Canada on this nomenclature. Some conditions are considered primary by some newborn screening programs, but secondary by other newborn screening programs. Standardization of case definitions are key to allowing for direct comparability between newborn screening programs. Well-defined case definitions are also important to allow for data collection and assessment as part of quality improvement activities. The advisory panel discussed and acknowledged that there needs to be greater clarity surrounding the intent of the proposed Pan-Canadian newborn screening list. The list is being proposed as a foundation to support movement towards more consistent newborn screening in Canada. The list is not intended to defund screening for any conditions that are currently a part of newborn screening programs and is not intended to deter programs for considering the addition of new conditions to their programs. The advisory panel fully agrees that it is important that newborn screening programs retain their autonomy and the ability to tailor their programs to their local needs. There are many reasons for variation in screening practices across Canada, such as differences in populations across jurisdictions, differences in evidence review processes, and the rarity of some of the conditions. The advisory panel will provide additional details to explain why certain conditions may require an evidence review within the final report. The need for case definitions was highlighted by many respondents, and it was also a topic that the advisory panel had discussed in earlier meetings. The advisory panel acknowledges the role of case definitions and will highlight this need as a priority within the final report. The final section of the discussion paper reviewed anticipating emerging conditions for newborn screening. These conditions are not yet available for screening in Canada. An emerging condition may be a condition that has been added to or is under review by a newborn screening program in another country. It may also include conditions that have novel treatments that should be monitored for clinical utility and system readiness. In the discussion paper, the advisory panel proposed 11 conditions as a starting point for the emerging condition list. An additional 19 conditions were proposed by respondents through the online consultation and focus group sessions and key informant interviews. A full list of proposed emerging conditions will be included in the final report. Through the course of the advisory panel's work, several out-of-scope topics were raised. Although these elements are out of scope, the advisory panel acknowledges that they are important within the broader context of newborn screening and have implications for newborn screening in Canada. Specifically, the advisory panel felt it would be important to highlight the following topics. While this report focused on blood spot testing, the advisory panel recognizes that there are other types of newborn screening tests, such as pulse oximetry for critical congenital heart disease and biliary atresia screening. Future newborn screening work could explore here. Well, this report focused on, another consideration that was highlighted was genomic sequencing. While genomic sequencing was out of scope for the advisory panel's work, it is important to acknowledge that this technology is rapidly evolving and could find a place in newborn screening programs in the future. Recognizing that this area is still at a research stage, further exploration into genomic sequencing and its potential impact should be considered. Laboratory infrastructure was another issue raised. When proposing the addition of conditions to a test panel, there are many components that need to be in place in order to operationalize the expansion. Some newborn screening programs may be better positioned than others This concept of readiness links the guiding principles of equity, recognizing that there are disparities in the newborn screening landscape across Canada. Another consideration was for data sharing, privacy, and quality metrics. While data sharing was considered out of scope, the advisory panel recognizes the importance of integrated data systems. Data sharing and analysis allows for quality improvement and can also support monitoring and evaluation of patient outcomes. Relatedly, privacy was identified as an area of concern, particularly from the public perspective. Processes for maintaining privacy need to be developed and established. Early engagement with the public will be an important step when developing these processes. Quality metrics was identified as an important initiative, as newborn screening programs may use different laboratory methods or laboratory cutoff values when identifying a positive newborn screening test. Developing quality metrics at a national level can support quality, equity, and safety of screening across the country, tying into the guiding principles. Lastly, educational materials were highlighted as an important consideration among interested parties. While aspects of possible educational materials was described within the exploratory model for newborn screening, the advisory panel wanted to highlight that the development of such educational materials for both clinicians and parents should be culturally appropriate and easily understandable, plain language, and available in multiple languages. I'm going to pass back to Whitney. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilary. I have the pleasure of talking about our next steps after all the information we've heard now. So for next steps, we want to highlight that multiple reports will be published on Canada's Drug Agency's website. There will be 3 separate summaries highlighting the input that was received through the online consultation forums, the focus group discussions, and the key informed interviews. We will also be publishing the final newborn screening recommendations report at the end of this month. Within the final report, there will be non-binding recommendations to support the feasibility of implementation of the newborn screening guidance document as well. And as a concluding message, we would just like to say the advisory panel would like to thank the individuals and organizations who participated in all of the engagement activities. Your engagement and perspectives have been instrumental in supporting the advancement of newborn screening guidance and work that we have done. We truly appreciate your time and contribution. Thank you so much. On behalf of myself and Hilary, my co-chair, I'm going to pass it back to Dan.
Yeah, continuing with the thank yous, on behalf of CDA AMC, I'd like to personally thank our panel co-chairs for doing such an amazing job in leading this work. Thanks very much to all of you for taking the time to join today. The input from the online consultation and focus groups are actually now posted on our website for anyone interested. And you can see here other ways that you can connect with Canada's Drug Agency and follow our work. I'd just like to close our session today by offering each of our co-chairs the opportunity to share a reflection on their experience collaborating on this really important work. Maybe I'll start with you, Hilary.
Great, thanks, Dan. Well, as a newborn screening program director and a participant, I hope that all this work can actually materialize and be sustainable. I hope that it lands well with Health Canada, the federal government, and that we receive an investment. I'm excited by all this work, the conversations, the input we've received, and it has just reinforced how important all of this is. And yeah, it's been a great learning experience for me, and I'm excited about next steps. Thank you.
Over to you, Whitney.
Yeah, the experience has been incredible. I have to say, in 2022, when Immunity Canada wrote a report about newborn screening with the Network for Rare Blood Disorder Organizations, looking at the state of newborn screening for rare disease across Canada, we really had no idea that, you know, we would end up here. I think working with CDA has been a wonderful experience. The team is incredible, but also, you know, and I think we interviewed Hilary for that report as well, and it was such a wonderful insight. And now I've been able to work with Hilary at this level, which has been fantastic. I think the committee itself has been so dedicated, and the insights that we've been able to gain. It's been a real pleasure and a great experience. I think the report itself and everyone who was fed into the report, all the engagement we've had, the response was overwhelming. It just goes to show the need and want from everyone across Canada involved in newborn screening, from the newborn screening programs themselves to the patient organizations, to everyone involved, the want for greater consistency across the programs, the want for greater access and greater equity, and the need there for that sustainability of a program, I think is so important. And as Hilary said too in the presentation, there's so much that can be achieved from the data sharing, and I think that we have a really wonderful idea, like the ideas are here. It's a really great case. Can we continue on to the next step? Surely I think we can. And I think we've made a good case to reach that greater consistency across Canada for that pan-Canadian collaboration in that model.
That's great. We did get a couple of late breaking questions, but I don't think we can actually do them justice in the short time that we have left. So I encourage those folks, please get in touch with us through our website. There's a generic inbox that you can send questions to that we monitor and respond to, and feel free to get in touch with us for any other information. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you.